discussions on coordination. So this asymmetric, in the types of intervention, quantitative easing and interest rates affect capital flows and exchange rate, but G20 does not regard these as market manipulation. Emerging markets have thin markets where capital flows cause very large asset price movements, and there is a market development process they have to follow. And it is not their own interest rates, as we saw in that graph, but global growth and risk on, risk off, which affects capital flows. So it's an externality for them. And the capital controls are called residency-based controls, taxes, limits, caps. All these are regarded as beggar thy neighbor policies. So you're benefiting yourself and hurting the other country by using them. But the pro-cyclical movement in markets suggests that there is space for intervention to establish fundamentals, reduce excess volatility in markets, which tend to show overshooting, trend following, rational bubbles. Literature is full of these kind of issues. So I think I'm going back. So the G20 capital flow management guidelines, capital surges create systemic risk, so they include, there's been discussion recently, IMF, OECD code, so macroprudential measures are included in capital flow management, since it's recognized, there is some movement in this, that capital, in recognizing these risks, it's recognized that capital surges create systemic risk. And there's discussion of currency-based controls, such as taxes on non-core foreign exchange liabilities of banks, caps on foreign exchange derivatives. But the discussion is, it's always about applying this to the recipients of capital flows. They should be applied to the sources also to reduce pro-cyclicality. That discussion is not there. In the US, for example, margins and position limits. The US had this commodity futures market modernization act in 2000, which reduced margins and position limits for swap dealers and so on. And the large oil price volatility followed. And that has hurt global growth and so on. Moreover, the discussion, and so it should have been internalized by the G20. There should have been discussion on this. Moreover, the discussion follows the OECD Code on Financial Liberalization. Now, if you see, there are 34 OECD countries and 152 emerging and developing economies. So where is the balance? And even in terms of economic power, now the share of economic output, emerging markets are larger than the advanced economies. Moreover, the discussion tends to be very bank-focused. And there are conditions such as that there is a market-making obligation. If every country imposed controls, markets would collapse. This would hurt everybody. And so you'd have to show why your intervention is necessary if you're intervening in constraining markets. But there should be a distinction between systemic and developing countries and the stages of the market. Market development is the more relevant issue rather than market making for many emerging and developing economies. So different criteria should be allowed. The other problem in the discussion is the shadow banks are neglected. So since banks are bearing the brunt of a lot of the regulation changes and tightening, large cross-border flows now are dominated by hedge funds and equity and private equity and so on. So just to conclude by going back to the directions, because G20 is trying to set directions. Look at the direction set in the post-World War II Bretton Woods conference, the discussion that set up the MDGs. So there was a negotiated draft which came after long dialogue, the way these global things work. And the phrase in italics, what was suggested was all members, whatever the stages of the economic development, you need to benefit all members, whatever the stages of, so that would have created this distinction between countries at different stages and what is required for them, some differentiation in the criteria and the policy adopted. But the final draft, which was acceptable to the US, was that particular phrase was to be the development of productive resources of all member countries. So there's no differentiation there. It was a license to assume the same macroeconomic framework applies for all countries, and moreover an uneven weight for countries. So I would conclude by saying that we've seen currency volatility more than currency wars, and there's excess volatility driven by capital flows and markets, both markets and advanced economies now would welcome less volatility because they are getting that spillback from this. And not differentiating and thinking in the same way or not giving due weight to emerging markets is hurting advanced economies also now. So the possibilities of genuine coordination rise, and there's a diversity of ideas is required. So there has been a coordination failure because of differential shocks on advanced economies and emerging. If you have the same shocks, you need to do the same thing. There's no need for coordination. It's when shocks are different and you need to do different things which impose spillovers or on other kind of countries. So this, and also because of differential shocks, the coordination failure also because of perceptions of unequal impact on global demand of advanced economies and emerging markets. So changes to improve the stability of the international financial system are required. And G20 action would really, G20 can make the most coordination, most contribution wherever coordination is required. Because that's when countries acting together can do much better than one country acting on its own, when they have spillbacks and spillovers on each other's. So what is required is excess correcting mechanisms more evenly applied. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Sherma. That was an eloquent presentation, really interesting, and covered the whole gamut of international monetary cooperation issues. So I'm sure we're going to have a good and rich discussion now. I'll turn it over to Shubir, who will also make some remarks, and then I think we'll open it up for a discussion. Thanks.
Thank you. Is it okay if I speak from here? Yeah. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Rajat, for inviting me to participate in the seminar. I've been here several times in several capacities. But this was a quick, short notice swap. I had a very elaborate presentation on monetary policy coordination, but I was last minute asked to do this. I'm joking. But I'm going to talk about a few issues, some of which were raised by Ashima, and try and place them into what I would consider a kind of a realistic assessment of the G20 and its capabilities. But Tom, I was struck by your initial comment about a world central bank, and if that would solve all our problems. I don't know if you're a Trekkie. I don't know if you're a Star Trek fan, but they had a world government there, but then monetary policy became captive to the differences in the United Federation of Planets. So you're never going to get away from differences. You can have a world government, but then you're trading with other planets, and the same problems arise. So the Klingons or whoever. But I think the basic question of comparative devaluation clearly is motivated by what has happened in China, and the fears that this is a process that will be used by China as a strategy to deal with what is being seen as a significant slowdown, reflected certainly in its export performance over the last few months, but also somewhat wider signs of slowdown. The official numbers still suggest growth at slightly over 7%, but there is a large community of skeptics about this. I'm not going to get into that issue, but I think we start with a basic sort of dilemma here, because we are in a world, and Ashima laid this out very clearly in the reference to the IMF's notion of an ideal exchange rate regime, in which the whole world, including the G20, has been basically asking China to move to a floating exchange rate regime. And China's response to accusations of mercantilism in this particular episode has been, well, we are reforming our system. We're doing what the rest of you have been asking us to do, and so what's the problem? I recall an event, a seminar in China in 2011. It was a G20 event. The IMF was one of the sort of the partners with with the Chinese government, I suppose, but it was formally a set of think tanks, in which the message was that we are moving towards a relatively freely floating exchange rate. This is in our interest to do because we want to to increase our global engagement, and this is one way to do it. And over the next 5 years, we will take steps to achieve this. Now, it so happened that this step, which was in a sense a technical change in the way in which the exchange were determined, which would also suggest that it becomes more of a floating rate, was taken in a situation which happened to work to China's advantage. And I think that's a perfectly rational act, that you would not take a step in any situation, if it was a good step, that would, in the short term at least, work to your disadvantage. So it is consistent with that broad, call it commitment, call it signal, that exchange rate reform is underway. And so I think we have to wait and watch to see whether it really is competitive devaluation, or is it just one step in the process of currency reform. Now, we won't know this till the tide turns. We won't know this until we find out what the Chinese response to a pressure to appreciate will be. Will they let the currency appreciate, in which case I think all of the concerns about competitive devaluation should be pushed into the background, or they will not let it appreciate, in which case we are back to a situation where the currency is being used as an instrument to promote exports, to increase competitiveness, which is being eroded by other factors, and clearly then poses some sort of a threat to the rest of the world. So that's the first point. I think when we talk about competitive devaluation in the context of what has happened in China over the last few weeks and months, I think really it is not a cop-out to say that the jury is still out. We don't know whether this is genuinely a first step in a process of currency reform, or whether it was an act of desperation trying to promote exports. And I think until we see evidence to the contrary, we should not rush to judgment that this is the end of the world. The second point I want to make is, let's be realistic about the G20. It is about it. Yes, it is the 20 largest, 19 largest economies plus double counting the EU. But it is a hugely heterogeneous group. It is, there are rich countries and not so rich countries. There are commodity exporters and commodity importers. There are countries which have conflicts. There are countries which don't, at least in matters of degree. There are labor-intensive or labor-abundant countries and not so labor-abundant countries. You cannot imagine a more heterogeneous group. And when you look at all of the theoretical foundations of coordination, and one could sort of refer to sort of the Mundelean concept of an optimal currency area, for example, which I believe the euro is to some extent founded on. Some degree of homogeneity, I think, is a sort of almost a necessary condition. That if you have wide differences, yes, there are benefits from trade because of different factor endowments, but not necessarily benefits from coordination. I think the euro story is one very striking example of this. The original eurozone may have well fulfilled the conditions that an optimal currency area required. The extended eurozone, and as we've seen with Greece, clearly didn't. At least my take on Greece is fundamentally it had an overvalued exchange rate, which, because it was part of an arrangement, it simply could not get out of quickly enough. It could not make the domestic adjustments necessary to offset that disadvantage, and it got itself into trouble. Now, there are various factors that contributed to this, But in talking about global, the optimal response of different countries to a given global scenario, this heterogeneity is absolutely critical. Every country is going to find or look for its own set of solutions. And the currency wars argument in 2010 is very illustrative of this. Finance Minister of Mantega made a huge deal of it, talking about almost a sense of betrayal that here was a group that had found some solidarity, had dealt with the crisis of 2008-9 with collective action and sort of a common sense of purpose. And so soon after that, when some countries were recovering, the US was betraying that solidarity, was going against it. And the US response, articulated by Chairman Bernanke, was firstly, well, I suppose I'm putting it crassly, Brazilians don't vote for US Congress. My mandate is given to me by the Congress, and it does not have an external component. There's nothing in my mandate that suggests I have to worry about what is going on in the rest of the world. My objective is to maintain price and employment stability in the US. But a more sort of inclusive answer was that, is the world better off with a growing US economy or a stagnant or US economy in recession? So you may be worried about currency dynamics in the short term, but the long-term benefits that accrue from a US recovery, sustained US recovery, will offset that. That was it. So there is, even though we don't take the concerns of other countries directly into our monetary policy framework, the fact that the US is kind of a global magnet of sorts, a pivotal economy, and its health and its well-being does have positive spillovers. So you should be content with that. I don't think it was that. It's not an issue that was resolved. Things sort of, to some extent, the issue went off the radar screen. Other problems materialized and so on. But I think at what it illustrates is that there are huge limits to coordination across such a heterogeneous group of countries. And we've tested those limits in the way that the G20 has progressed over the last 5 years since it became a summit-oriented event. I think we have reasonable opportunities and have made reasonable progress in terms of coordination across some structural domains. I think the movement on, it's not a one world regulatory framework, but information sharing, some sort of harmonization. Basel III, one could perhaps raise some questions about, but I think in principle, the idea that you have a globally interlinked financial system subject to broadly the same set of prudential regulations is a reasonable principle. Its implementation is raising issues, but it's a reasonable principle. So I think those are areas where we've had relative success, and the common underlying theme is that they are somewhat structural in nature. When it comes to dealing with short-term pressures and forces of recession, forces of immediate macroeconomic meltdowns or crisis, I think the 2008 response was the exception, because that was a situation in which every country felt the same set of compulsions. It was do or die. Everybody had to do roughly the same things, massive stimulus. Everybody had to do it. And so it worked well as a coordinated response. But if you're not in that situation where every country is faced with the same set of pressures, I think it is unrealistic to expect that the that this group will respond with the same kind of coordination or collective set of priorities as we saw in 2008. So here we should expect that each country will act in its own interests. It's always a matter of debate whether the policy choice is the right one or not. But I don't think we need to debate the fact that it is being made on the basis of the perception of the policymaker that this is in the interests of that country, regardless of its consequences to the outside world. I mean, that may be a peripheral factor in consideration.